O.G. Rose, and today we're going to be reading from Belonging Again, II.1. We are starting with Chapter 3. We finished Chapter 2, where we discussed Simone Weil, Lorenzo's work on Nash equilibria, collective intelligence, game theory dynamics, and the importance of neurodiversity to avoid game theory problems like Nash equilibria, Kenneth Arrow preference choice, and all these other sort of situations where if you simply do what is rational, you actually end up with a suboptimal result. And we talked about Simone Weil as being a possible reference point, personification of an example of a neurodiverse individual. Because what we need today is not simply for people to be more intelligent or more rational, but to have a different kind of thinking entirely. And now we're going to be starting Chapter 3, Plans of Affliction or Preparation for Singularity. We will talk about Ivan Illich. We will talk about Cadell Last, Systems and Subjects. But to start, on Chapter 3.1, it is titled Pluralism, the Essential Limits of Mind, and the Affliction of Globalization and Pluralism. And affliction is a word from Simone Weil, which we can associate with AA entrapment. And so to begin, we have described how leaving Plato's cave on our own would require divergent thinking and forms of motivation that are not typical, which is ultimately to say that we today, to address the concerns of belonging again, part 1, say with Philip Reeve, Peter Berger, and all of them, must become like Nietzsche's children. Here, we will elaborate on the state of our current historical moment to add further imperative to why we need to become children. We will connect the truism of the rational trilogy, the absolute choice, and belonging again, all by O.G. Rose, and further describe the character of the cave and its qualities in which we currently find ourselves stuck, which we will later describe as needing to change in terms of meta-architecture if we are to incubate and spread childhood. What follows could also be seen as a further description of affliction and discourse, which further suggests the need for menti-divergence, AB. We will describe the qualities of affliction and rational impasses in our pluralistic and globalized world today, where the only way to transcend it is to pay attention to that very affliction, which will ultimately lead us to orbiting and focusing on a common paradox, which we will associate with lack, mystery, the apathetic, and so on. As we have touched on, affliction is often autonomously rational, which is ultimately impossible and self-effacing, but affliction is a state in which we don't think the limits of rationality. Hell is locked from the inside, we might say, and so it becomes cancerous, as Alex Ebert discusses. Rationality itself consists of essential limitations that, until we recognize, we cannot act according to and still consider ourselves epistemologically moral and rational for good reason, which might help us maintain existential stability. And that's an allusion to Clifford and Weil and Lewis and different people. In other words, if we don't accept the ways thinking is useless, paradoxical, and or ironic, we cannot reinvent what constitutes being rational according to, say, attention or rhetoric, for we will fail to change our organizing truth. What a people believe is true is what that people will emergently and organically organize themselves toward, and if that truth and or truths are poor ones, the people will reflect and manifest that impoverishment. Similarly, to allude to the absolute choice on Hegel, if we understand that the ontological and metaphysical foundation of reality is AB versus AA, then it becomes epistemologically responsible to engage in AB, for AA is unveiled to be essentially incomplete and ultimately self-effacing. So if it becomes the case that reality is incomplete, then to so organize and structure rationality then aligns with epistemic responsibility, because that is the case. To resume. To allude to the truism of the rational and belonging again the essays, all worldviews must structurally consider compromise as intellectual betrayal, even if finding a middle ground is the only practical way to resolve an issue, enable the government to function, and so on. And this is from the place of the AA, What's Natural. If I believe abortion is murder, then supporting a bill that doesn't entirely dismantle abortion clinics could be for me to spread injustice. If I believe global warming will cause the world incredible suffering, then any position that, say, helps big oil could be unjust. If I believe Christ is the Son of God, then all activities that treat Christianity as equal to other religions might not only be promoting a lie, but possibly contribute to people suffering damnation, and so on. This isn't to say that, though, through hermeneutics and theology, a take on, say, Christianity cannot arises that believes in universalism, for example, but it is to say that if this Christianity arises, it must mean in its structure that those who don't believe in universalism are wrong, and thus compromise with people would be to some degree a violation of the truth. All of this suggests a rational impasse for which we need a menti-divergent child. And the point is that every worldview entails these kind of structural problems that lend epistemic ethics, epistemic responsibility in favor of entrapment and ideology and so on. We cannot believe in X without thinking that those who don't believe in X are wrong. Even if we think that everyone is right, we thus think that those who claim not everyone is right are mistaken. Embedded in the structure of belief itself is exclusion and definition, and thus worldviews must structurally be against compromise to some degree. Since rationality is relative to truth, ideologies make compromise irrational, and thus people who are trying to be intellectually coherent must be against that which is necessary in our pluralistic age. Accepting tragedy, accepting compromise, engaging in substantive democracy, as Dr. Hunter talks about, and so on. Rationality is not enough. It is what both threatens and empowers pluralism. What is needed is something like non-rationality that seemingly only someone like Simone Weil could embody, or at least it's quite rare. It is not only irrationality that makes people against compromise, but also rationality. The solution is not more knowledge, but increased awareness of the nature and structure of ideology and rationality themselves. Though often good, increased knowledge might only strengthen the structure of our ideology and worldview. Such will not necessarily help us see how the structures of worldviews themselves set us up to rationally and justly self-destruct a Nash equilibrium. Essential limits are those which operate according to, operating according to is not a shortcoming, but rational, understandable, and epistemologically reasonable, to allude to W.K. Clifford. Thus, if we understand that worldviews and their structure must make compromise irrational and self-betrayal, then we can understand that compromise is still rational in the space between worldviews, which is to say, in the environment of pluralism. Understanding the essential limits of rationality can then enable us to be rational, epistemologically responsible, and intellectually stable to ourselves anew and differently, AB, which increases the likelihood that the majority will in fact engage in compromise. In his book Man and the State, Jacques Maritain wrote on the problem of finding reconciliation between competing worldviews and stressed the need to focus on practical grounds for reconciliation as opposed to grounds where different philosophical and or theoretical views converged. On the topic of human rights, to make broader points, Maritain wrote, and this is Jacques Maritain, who also wrote the book Degrees of Knowledge, which is lovely. So this is Maritain. Yet it would be quite futile to look for a common rational justification of these practical conclusions and these rights. If we did so, we would run the risk of imposing arbitrary dogmatism or of being stopped short by irreconcilable differences. The question raised at this point is that of the practical agreement among men who are theoretically opposed to one another. Since the aim of UNESCO, so this is kind of the United Nations, back when he's speaking, UNESCO, is a practical aim, agreement among its members can be spontaneously achieved, not on common speculative notions, but on common practical notions, not on the affirmation of the same conception of the world, man, and knowledge, but on the affirmation of the same set of convictions concerning action. The present state of intellectual division among men does not permit agreement on a common speculative ideology, nor in common explanatory principles. However, when it concerns, on the contrary, the basic practical ideology and the basic principles of action implicitly recognized today, etc., happen to constitute gross modo, a sort of common residue, or a sort of unwritten common law at the point of practical convergence of extremely different theoretical ideologies and spiritual traditions. To resume the text, what Maritain saw happening has only intensified with pluralism. Now more than ever, we need to cease trying to find agreement on speculative grounds and focus on the concrete, though not mere pragmatics, as discussed in phenomenological pragmatism and our work on Nietzsche. If people knew what Martin argued here, and if his argument was somehow proven or provided good reason to believe, then what was considered the rational life could change, and what was once epistemologically immoral could become epistemically responsible. Martin also wrote, and this is him again, if a theoretical reconciliation, a truly philosophical synthesis is desired, this could only come about as a result of a vast amount of probing and purification, which would require higher intuitions, a new systemization, and the radical criticisms of errors and confused ideas. Good to see you, John. Thank you for stopping in. Hope you had a good holiday. What a truly philosophical synthesis seemingly requires is an incredibly brilliant majority of people. But under pluralism, I'm not even sure if that's possible, considering that each worldview operates according to different axioms and first principles, unless perhaps we might spread childhood, because it does seem to be needing to align with Simone Weil, as we've spoken on. If indeed it is the case that such a synthesis is not possible, between some ideologies at least, then this is all the more reason why our understanding of what constitutes rationality should shift. If it is the case that rationality indeed consists of the essential limits described in this work, then not only is it rational to compromise on Martin's more practical grounds, but also rational on rational grounds. Compromise is not an intellectual conceit. To allude to story democracy, which is a concept that came up with Andrew Luber in a topics conversation, it becomes rational to enter the stories of others, but for now it seems the majority feel that working with people who think different from them is intellectual betrayal, perhaps a response, which is the exact opposite of menti-divergence. And indeed, John, menti-divergence is alluding to neurodivergence, as we talked about before. So to resume, pluralism is devolving into tribalism, not just because people are irrational, but also because people are trying to stay true to their rationality, which is indivisible from the truth. Upcycle, wonderful to see you. People do generally try to be rational actors, but since rational and best or true are not similes, this fact doesn't tell us very much. They can overlap, but they're not similes. Failure to understand that rational and best aren't similes has led to us to dismiss the idea that people are rational actors, which, though somewhat justified, can also go too far and contribute to us believing that democracy, debate, and so on can accomplish little. Under this thinking, democracy can be a threat to our country, and avoiding the other can also become a rational course. Power and force seem destined. And we have in mind here, there's a paper called The True Isn't the Rational. It can be found under the audio summaries. It's in The Map is Indestructible, and this distinction between the true and the rational. If I think it's going to rain today, it becomes rational to bring an umbrella, but let's say it doesn't rain. Does that mean I was irrational? No, I was rational relative to what I thought was true, and I turned out to be wrong. So what we believe is true organizes what is rational, but that means there's a distinction between rational and truth, even though the way that I structure myself according to what I think is true tends to, well, it has to be through the filter of rationality. So there's this interesting tension here. And I appreciate it, John. Thank you. And again, Upcycle, always great to see you. To resume. We have long emphasized the need of education and rationality for democracy to work, but so cherishing these ideals, we might have ignored their essential limits. And by the word essential, I have in mind the distinction, say, in classical thought between accident and essential. So we are saying that rationality entails an essential limit to its very structure, which, please note, if rationality actually, well, comes to conclude and accept rationally, then makes the tearing with those limits rational in and of itself. There's a kind of interesting absorbing moment that occurs. To resume. Worldviews have always consisted in their structure a rendering of compromise immoral, and pluralism is simply showing us the world that we've always been in. It is unveiling the world more than changing it. Worldviews and ideologies are necessarily exclusive truth claims, as Timothy Keller has argued, and thus they are necessarily against compromise in of themselves. Those who live according to an ideology, as we all do, must locate the rationally justified grounding for compromise in the space between ideologies, AB. Otherwise, they will struggle to feel existentially stable about what they are doing, even though it's necessary for pluralism to avoid self-destruction. Another reality which can help ground us. If it is indeed the case that ideologies ultimately diverge at the level of axioms, as suggested by, say, Thomas Sowell in A Conflict of Visions, which I think that might be his best book. I really do like that one. This knowledge, too, can help individuals intellectually and existentially cope with compromise and so escape affliction and discourse, which we associate with Kafka. For affliction today seems structured according to epistemic responsibility, as the conflict of mind discusses, particularly the paper called The Conflict of Mind, making it particularly afflictive. Furthermore, this affliction is one that makes rationality seem unlimited as autonomous, which doesn't seem afflicting at all, but incredibly empowering. Aren't we grateful? Aren't we powerful as we sit in Plato's cave? And the point there is under affliction, or what we could also associate, say, totality in maybe a Bernard de Juvenel sense. When you totalize something, AA, you don't seem trapped at all because it feels unlimited. This is the weird move. Rationality that does not acknowledge its limits experience itself unlimited, so not afflicted. But the great problem, like Simone Weil or Lewis says, is when you are afflicted, you're also afflicted from knowing you're afflicted. When you're in despair, you can't know your despair, as Kierkegaard might say. Hell's locked from the inside, as Lewis might put it. So when you're stuck in something, and truly stuck, you can't even see the thing you're stuck in. So that's that weird enclosure invisibility that kind of comes with affliction and AA. So that's what we're getting at there. So limit, which would seem to be an experience of affliction, oh my gosh, I'm limited, is actually a movement of attention and moving out of that affliction, because now you see the limit. Oh my goodness, it is good to see you, my friend. Thank you for coming in. It's wonderful. Thank you, Michael. Goodness. But to resume, and I'm glad to join you on your walk. Goodness. To resume, if believing rationality is limited, is rational. If believing that rationality is limited is rational, then it's rational to act and live according to those limits. But if proof, or at least good reason, cannot provide that rationality indeed entails essential limits, then it cannot be epistemically responsible to compromise amid pluralism or to become menti-divergent like they or a child, suggesting the necessity of conceptual mediation in Hegel. Furthermore, as Martha Nussbaum discusses in The Fragility of Goodness, if we don't know that we lack a philosophical category of tragedy and irony in our thinking, then we cannot stop ourselves from realizing that what seems to be a failure of the democratic order is rather just a necessary trade-off between, say, freedom and equality, privacy and safety, and so on. Complete victory is unnecessary and impossible. Ideas matter, for they are by which people decide what constitute the proper practice and means by which they interpret and consider the world. Interpretation is inescapable. It matters like ideas. Self-skepticism matters, for it helps connect knowledge to practice. If I know about confirmation bias but don't practice self-skepticism, an act of attention, then confirmation bias will just be a lens through which I see and understand others, but it easily won't be an idea that I use on myself. Affliction. If I know that people can be wrong, that freedom is in everything, that self-skepticism is important, and so on, but don't regularly ask myself, how do I know I'm right? Or how do I know which freedoms are good? Or so on, then I will fail to live through my knowledge. There will always be a disconnect. And do note that the person who practices self-skepticism 30 minutes ago will not necessarily be someone practicing self-skepticism tomorrow. We can never take our self-skepticism for granted. As discussed throughout the Truism of the Rational, we all naturally experience our rationality as autonomous, for we experience and think everything through our rationality, which makes it seem like everything is always rational solely. To not fall into this natural way of thinking, which leads to affliction, AA, we basically just have to know better, an act which is non-rational, and yet the moment we think this very thought, it will seem like rationality on its own made this realization, because rationality so quickly consumes the non-rational into itself. So for example, if you understand that emotional intelligence is important, well, the moment you think about, wow, emotional intelligence is important, you experience it through a rational lens, right? So it feels like it's always rational. There's this quick consuming moment that's very hard to keep up with. So the moment you make emotions meaningful to you, you consume them into rationality, making it seem like it was always rational. You basically just have to remember the moment before you thought about it, which you have to remember the moment before the consuming, which suggests why memory is such a big deal in, say, Plato or Dante or other classical thoughts. There seems to be something really important about memory. And if you forget something, then you also forget the basis of a distinction that if you lose, you could end up in, well, affliction, autonomous AA thinking, and so on and so forth. To resume, we basically just have to know the non-rational played a role, and a functioning pluralism will be one in which the average person just knows that their worldview, ideology, and the like is non-rationally grounded and hence menti-divergent. This will not be natural, as AB is unnatural versus natural AA, and yet this way of thinking will be paramount. If the average person proves incapable of it, we will suffer for it. Maintaining pluralism requires the right ideas, and where there are no epistemic adjustments for pluralism, existential anxiety will likely rise, and totalitarianism will gain an appeal to restore existential stability. Where people fail to understand that worldviews must necessarily reject compromise as epistemically irresponsible as is necessary in pluralism, people will struggle to compromise without feeling like they are betraying themselves, leading them to anxiety and worse. Where AB becomes increasingly needed, if we are stuck in AA, we will suffer. Where people don't understand tragedy and irony, democracy will be unable to engage in necessary and unavoidable trade-offs without being seen as failing, increasing the likelihood that people will become disillusioned about it. Where people don't practice self-skepticism, the likelihood that knowledge and practice connect is slim. Knowledge will likely only be used as a weapon against others. Rationality can operate rationally according to its essential limits if people believe and are taught those limits. Hence, the purpose of the truism, the rational, and the absolute choice. Regardless of what people believe, those limits will be present. But if people don't learn about them, people will still define being rational as operating like those limits don't exist. AA. Outlining and describing the nature and limits of rationality itself is pivotal if we are to redefine what constitutes rationality, what constitutes being rational in a manner that accepts the limits of rationality, AB. And if we fail to teach people how they can be rational actors without ignoring the limits of rationality, we will potentially imply to people who strive to be rational that it is a waste of time. If rationality is abandoned versus redefined with a new truth about rationality itself, AB, both democracy and pluralism will suffer. Existential anxiety will spread, increasing the likelihood of totalitarianism. I do not mean to imply in this section that rationality is all we need or that it is more important than the other intellectual acts like empathy, creativity, or emotional intelligence. Rationality is only part of a needed whole. Also, as rationality needs to be redefined with its limits, so rationality also needs to incorporate acts like empathy into itself as being rational to engage in, kind of absorbing it into its structure, precisely because empathy is needed for truth to be best approximated, as argued in On Critical Thinking by O.G. Rose, which will be found in The Map is Indestructible. As rationality needs to understand its limits, it also needs to expand its horizons to menti-divergence with attention. And there is, I think that's great, John. The AI question comes up in Belonging Again II.1 in the context of the work of Andrew Luber and Alex, who talk about theme. And basically, AI is going to give us the thought that we give it. If we give it AA, it will magnify AA. If we give it AB or work with it cooperatively to create AB, and Lorenzo does work to show that human AI partnerships actually give you better results than pure AI activities, then it could be a very good thing. But, AI is actually going to function as what we talk about as the causer to force upon us the question of the absolute choice. So that all has to be elaborated on. It came out of the parallax course, but look to the birds of the air. But it's a really good conversation. Yeah, that's right. It can be used to manipulate people. That's exactly right. So it's going to magnify it's going to magnify the horizon according to what we think, not merely give us more of what we think. It's going to magnify the very scope of how we define knowledge and how we approach knowledge and what we think knowledge is. And that could be great, or it could be total damnation. It's at these, Alex Ebert and freak theory, which always talks about, the saturation point, where you get a certain saturation of a limit. And this brings with it the possibility of a threshold, a phase change, kind of a new paradigm, so on and so forth. So AI, in precisely making possible things like manipulation in that way, John, could be very intensifying. It could be it could be something that forces the question upon us the book will talk a lot in light of Ivan Illich of our the replacement of humanity or the extension of humanity. And that's exactly right, upcycle. It becomes related to extended cognition, exactly. So there's a relational dynamic between the human and the AI, and it makes the relation central to the product, to the productivity, to what happens from there. Yeah, that's right, dystopian. And I think at Theory Underground, Nance and them have been talking a lot about future fiction. So I'm going to be very curious about that project, John. But I'll resume here. Society benefits when people prize being rational. But if rationality is portrayed as a perfect and limitless ideal, AA, it won't be long before people fall under internally consistent affliction or notice the myth and perhaps throw the baby out with the bathwater. So there could be an issue here, unfortunately, where if you realize the totalizing tendencies of rationality, you may start saying, well, rationality is bad and we don't need it. But then that's not the way, because you could actually fall into a kind of autonomous non-rationality. The absolute choice, when we talk about Hegel, will bring that out more. But there's a ditch on both sides. You can have an autonomous non-rationality or an autonomous rationality, either or, which could be very, very problematic. And that, Michael, that's lovely. Is there a hierarchy that beats rationality, creativity, emotional intelligence? Is rationality structures these other aspects of human, or do they mutually afford each other? That's a tremendous question. For me, the hierarchy of epistemological methods, the map is indestructible. There's a part where we talk about rational sets, Benjamin Fontaine. The issue, it's one of the reasons to that question why I like to start from a phenomenological basis, because the way we make our experiences meaningful to us tends to be through rationality. So there's something quite primary about rationality to make sense of things. We do not naturally experience it as nested in emotions or nested in the body. We could, well, let me put it this way, especially after the printed press, the written word, the creation of the internal space. Dr. Anton has talked about that with Guy Senstock. There is an argument to be made that before the divide between the written word, writing, that we actually experienced words not as signifiers. We experienced the gap between the signifier and the signified is much smaller. We were much more profoundly worlded. And in being so worlded, it could easily be argued that rationality, as we know it today, was phenomenologically quite different. Anton talks about that. We'll talk about Anton at the end of this book when we talk about Levinas as well. And so there's an argument to be made that perhaps before the printing press, well, especially the written word, there was a different experience of reasoning, that it was easier to get a sense of its nestedness. But today, I think it is not so natural. I think it is quite difficult. Just because of our relation to ideas is primarily through written words, there feels to be, well, that Derrida, that gap, that divide between the signifier and the signified, that Derrida argued we can never move beyond in cadence. That's very good. Excellent upcycle. And we had a talk once, Michelle and I, in the car, about the Bible in an oral scripture, religion, oral versus written. It's quite important. Now, again, following William Ong, basically, the scientific treatise was not possible until the written word. Science, as we know it, was not possible because you couldn't get the syllogism. You couldn't get, William Ong is adamant that writing. It's not merely that writing recorded what we think. Writing changed how we think, and it allowed a different structure of thought that brought about science, and greatly intensified rationality. Also, not to say that rationality and science are similes, but our rational capacity seems to have certainly, dare I say, you could say, improved precisely because of writing, probably because it became more habituated to using abstraction. And creativity, technology, all of that really requires abstraction. So the more you're able to habituate yourself to using abstraction, the more you can probably do with you can do those kind of things. But here's the problem. The problem is that it works. We get so good at abstraction. It's so effective that it's easy to then view abstraction as what? Abstracted from the nest, that it isn't nested. It's an abstraction. So it's not nested in anything. And so, yes, that's right, Upside. I think LLMs bring this out. Beautiful. So what ends up happening, we got so good at rationality because of the written word, and I'll also talk about the internal space. Dr. Anton talks about how basically the idea of feeling angry and acting angry were two sides of the same coin before the written word. Like you couldn't divide those, but now we can actually divide them because we have a deeper internal space. Like we feel like there's more of a divide between feeling and action, that Anton will say. And in that divide, that means what? You're abstracting, you're pulling apart. And in so pulling them apart, you can look at them from a meta angle. All of that is a cognitive superpower. But in being a superpower, it is easy to then prioritize or reify thought independent of nesting, or what I'll call non-rationality, which then leads to autonomous rationality, which makes you go, oh man, then it will be super effective, right? Because it will be autonomous rationality. Well, it becomes unnested and unhuman. And without going too much into it, autonomous rationality, which I would tie to the birth of abstract thought, which you can actually, with David Hume, link to philosophy. Abstract thought leads actually to the possibility of capital. Capital, the commodity form, abstract social use, as Marx talks about, which then leads into, well, AI, as Nick Land will talk about. So abstraction, possible because of the written word, makes possible science, philosophy, abstract reasoning, which makes possible abstract economic utility, pragmatic basis principles like capital, the commodity form, whatever, which then, of course, leads to the singularity, ultimately, of a Nick Land. And that's where, Mikey Downs does such tremendous work on connecting capital, on Nick Land, and helps really bring out how the logic of capital as an abstract social use. Note that word abstract at the beginning of the capital. Following Marx, that would require a break between the internal and the external world, the internal space and the external world, and so that abstraction goes from there. Yes, I definitely separated the divide between the experts and the student created passive education. Absolutely. My goodness. Neil Postman, Teaching of the Subversive Act. Basically, in his book, also, The Disappearance of Childhood, it's the idea that the concept of childhood as distinct from adulthood didn't even exist. And I email anytime. Feel free, John. Is the idea of childhood came into birth as one who was not literate. You needed the printing press, because after the printing press is like someone who is an adult can read, whereas someone who's not an adult can't read. So there was a split. Also, like Michelle Bowens will talk about, basically bureaucracy, government structures, etc., needing writing in order to command people when you're not located in those kingdoms, and stuff like that. So you needed writing for a new relationship to bureaucracy, government, and power, right? So it absolutely created that divide, Michael. That's exactly right. To resume, this isn't to say that rationality is all we need, but that, like food, it's needed. However, this is not food we typically eat, playing on neurotypicalness, and even thinking to accept and consume it will require a different disposition that is not natural. And what we mean by this is the rational, non-rational dialectic that is not natural. It will require intention. Certainly, if you're going to spread it, you'd have to be intentional about the medium conditions, as I like to say, the situation of the society, to create habits that would change people. And that gets us into William Auld and different things. Anyway, the menti-divergent child could accept the offering, but how many of those are there? Some, obviously, but if we cannot spread the conditions needed so that there might be many and hope, does it matter? And that will bring us to the end of section 3, chapter 1. Next will be 2a, preparing attention before the lacking and visible to avoid afflicting plans of the visible. And that's going to get us into a talk I had with Cadell at Parallax and Ivan Illich, and the difference between prepare and plan. And also then what is lack as an apathetic basis of a society. And for more by OG Rose, please visit ogrose.com, Twitter, Anchor, Instagram, YouTube. You can find the book, Belonging Again II.1, on Amazon. All reviews, purchases are deeply appreciated. We also just released a short story collection called Under the Wing, Would love to hear your thoughts about that. We're very excited to have that in the world. And thank you so much for your time. Everyone, Upside John, thank you. Thank you all for being here. And I appreciate the time. Have a great day. All the best.